What does a relationship look like between a Type 4 individualist and a Type 8 challenger? Well, let's start off by talking about a few things they have in common. If I had to pick two Enneagram types that have been the most ridiculed, mocked, stereotyped, and/or flippantly judged by people with an incredibly shallow understanding of the Enneagram, then I would pick the Type 4 individualist and the Type 8 challenger. Now, the reason 4s and 8s get so much shit from ignorant Enneagram enthusiasts is simply because they're easy targets. The emotional roller coasters of your average 4 and the bulldozer-like attitude of your average 8 can be like human sandpaper because those traits live so close to the surface. By contrast, many of the other Enneagram types have it much easier when it comes to masking their less healthy traits because, quite frankly, our culture celebrates a lot of superficial behaviors that naturally feed the ego of us moralistic 1s or successful hustle 3s or good time 7s. So before we get going, I just wanted to pause and give this couple some extra love because I can see how this pairing would be turned off by the Enneagram community for constantly painting them in such a cliche and unattractive light. You 4s and 8s have just as much potential for healthy or dysfunctional relationships as the rest of us. Now, with that said, the Enneagram 4-8 relationship is one hell of a ride. It's just that anytime you have a relationship between two types that are both in the reactive group of the harmonic triad, you typically have some fireworks. As you see here, 4s, 6s, and 8s are all reactive types, which means they wear their emotional reactions on their sleeve, especially in regards to any painful or adverse situation. This also means that 4s and 8s tend to have a high value for authenticity because that's how they feel safe and connected to the people they love. 4s and 8s in particular believe that you should just be who you are at all times. No filters, no masks, no need for anything too polite or too polished. Just give them your honest thoughts and immediate reactions to whatever life throws at you. Obviously, that kind of authentic yet unfiltered communication is a recipe for one spicy relationship, but that's usually the way this couple likes it. Both 4s and 8s just want to feel alive, and that only happens when they're leaning into challenging situations or pushing the boundaries of their creative self-expression. Oddly enough, this shared desire for intensity makes them surprisingly tolerant and kind of even attracted to each other's rough edges. For example, 8s can get a bit of a rush from their pursuit of the broody, coy, or hard-to-get 4, while the 4 can get a rush from the 8's assertive, irreverent, and fairly indulgent impulses. Now, if we take a quick look at the shape of the Enneagram, you'll see that 4s and 8s have several points of connection that can also help explain some of their shared personality traits. First, 4s and 8s meet via these lines of integration and disintegration at the Type 2 helper. This creates a fascinating synergy between the 8, who can be rather nurturing when they feel secure, and the 4, who can be rather needy when they feel insecure. Furthermore, 8s disintegrate to the Type 5 investigator when they feel insecure, and they become far more isolated, analytical, and often a bit suspicious or even defensive against the outside world. Well, if a 4 has a 5 wing, they can actually meet the 8 in this more cerebral and withdrawn space. This means you could get one extremely intense yet somewhat individualistic pairing that's hyper-focused on their own little world together. But before we go any deeper into some of these nuanced Enneagram theories, let's pull up and talk about what specifically attracts the Type 4 individualist to the Type 8 challenger and vice versa. One of the first things that 4s are typically attracted to about 8s is how much time and energy they spend getting stuff done. 4s can often spend days living in their imagination, which then amplifies how difficult it feels to get back into the habit of being a productive, responsible adult. 8s, on the other hand, are energized by using their skills or strengths to have an impact on their environment. They also just have a really hard time sitting still, both physically and mentally. So whether it's making a living or making breakfast, the 8 is naturally motivated to do many things that the 4 often feels are just one of life's many burdens. The 8's practical nature can also be a great influence on the 4, who can be extremely prolific when they feel secure, which is described by their movement of integration to the more naturally self-disciplined Type 1 reformer. Okay, another point of attraction for the 4 can actually be the way that 8s are so shameless in their self-expression. If we take a look at the triadic centers, you'll see that 4s are in the heart center alongside Type 2 helpers and Type 3 achievers. Now, all heart types have a primary struggle with shame, which is why 4s are hypersensitive about their identity and the way that people see them. Eights, on the other hand, are gut types that instinctively pursue power. And since feelings don't feel powerful, they just trample right over them. So even though the eight's unfiltered bravado can be a bit exhausting at times, the four admires and often wishes they could embody the way that eights are so unaffected by public approval. All right, one last common point of attraction that often draws fours to eights is their unyielding sense of commitment. Once an eight has chosen you, they become deeply invested in your well-being. So when they choose the four, they become determined to ride out all the four's emotional turbulence, no matter how dramatic or depressive they may be. Ultimately, healthy eights strike this beautiful balance between tough love and gentle support, which goes a long way to ease the four's fear of being too broken to love. And on that sweet note, let's shift gears and talk about a few things that typically attract the Type 8 Challenger to the Type 4 Individualist. If you've ever seen Deadliest Catch, then you know what it's like when a Type 8 Challenger falls in love with a Type 4 Individualist. Eights are like the grizzled old fisherman who just can't help but sail out into the storm with waves threatening to capsize his boat, all in search of the thing he wants most, which is a Type 4 Individualist. All right, the metaphor kind of fell off at the end there, but you get where I was going. All I'm trying to say is that eights are well aware of the difficulty that will come from their pursuit of the four, but they just can't help but sail out into the waves of the four's intense and elusive emotional reactions for two reasons. First, eights like a challenge. No surprise there, it's in their name. And second, the eight knows the four has something they need. You see, eights have these big, soft hearts that they bury beneath a rough and tough exterior because they believe their emotions make them weak, and weak people get hurt. But the four can't help but experience and embrace their emotions, which is something that healthy fours use to empathize with other people, or tell compelling stories, or create beautiful works of art. So while the eight would rarely, if ever, be bold enough to risk the four's emotional exposure, deep down, they respect it because they know that the heart is where they have the biggest opportunity for growth. All right, speaking of needing a safe space to be vulnerable, eights often just need space in general, which is why they're very attracted to the independent spirit of the four. Eights love knowing that the four has plenty of ways to fill their time, so it's no problem if the eight needs to work late or travel for business. In fact, for most fours, absence makes the heart grow fonder, so it's kind of a win-win for the eight. Okay, last interesting point of attraction here stems from the fact that eights have quite the rebellious streak, which often attracts them to people that are more countercultural in some way. Now, that can mean many different things depending on your dominant culture, but whatever it is, the four is usually miles ahead when it comes to subverting social norms. And this is very similar to what I mentioned in the relationship episode on eights and fives. Many eights take pride in having a shocking or non-conformist partner like the four because it feels powerful. Like they're saying, we don't need approval from you all. We do our own thing, and quite frankly, we're pretty badass. All right, speaking of being a little bad, it's time to talk about what conflict looks like between fours and eights. Hey there, friend. Looks like you're a little more than halfway through this Enneagram relationship episode, which means it's a great time to not only watch this fancy little neon graphic float off into the distance, but to hit those like and subscribe buttons, you know? You know what I mean? You know those buttons that are sitting right there? Don't be coy, you know where they are. You know, if you're feeling non-committal, you can just hit the like button. It's still really helpful. Okay, let's get back to it. While eights have conflict with pretty much everyone, there's something unique about the way a four can take things to a whole nother level. As I mentioned at the start of this episode, fours and eights are both reactive types, so they bring a lot of emotional or impulsive reactions to their conflict. This also means that things can go from a minor offense to a major fight in the blink of an eye. Now, the minor offenses usually occur more often within the four, who brings a lot of sensitivity whenever they feel criticized or not taken seriously. And that's tricky for eights because they don't naturally value other people's feelings and will overemphasize the need for tough love, which kind of just comes across as calloused or dismissive to the more sensitive four. It's often just a matter of time until one of the eight's sharp comments hits the four's water balloon of emotion and everything just comes spilling out. Now, once the fight is on, eights by nature refuse to back down, and they will instinctively match the energy of whatever or whoever is coming at them. So while the four thinks, I'm just expressing myself, the eight thinks, well, I'm just defending myself. This all just goes back and forth, round and round, over and over again, usually until the four is just too physically exhausted to continue, all while the 8 refuses to tap out. Now, if there isn't a quick resolution here, this couple is prone to letting things fester because the 4 is naturally withdrawn, the 8 is naturally self-assured, and both types are fairly independent. And so they start drifting into separate activities or separate lives altogether. Now, I know I said earlier that distance can make the 4's heart grow fonder, but that's only in regards to physical distance, not emotional distance. And the less intimacy they have with the 8, the more they start to fantasize about other people or other places to run away to. And this is the big red flag for this couple, because if the 4 starts to express or even hint at some of these escapist fantasies, then the 8's fear of abandonment is instantly triggered. And this just makes it incredibly difficult for the 8 to resist going back on the offensive and attacking the 4 for being disloyal, dishonest, or just disengaged from the hard work of true commitment. Ultimately, the intensity of the 8's pursuit, which ironically brought this couple together, can be the very thing the 4 uses to justify their dramatic behavior or an excuse to leave the relationship entirely. All right, I'll pause there and say that that is just one possible outcome for a couple that is unwilling to do the hard work of personal growth. Speaking of which, it's time to wrap things up with just a little relationship advice that might help the 4-8 couple have a healthier future together. One major piece of advice I'd give the 4-8 couple is to notice and avoid the drama triangle. If you've never heard of this concept before, it's just a very simple pattern comprised of a villain, a victim, and a rescuer. The typical way this plays out in this relationship is that the 4 and the 8 take turns playing the victim and the villain. They then carve off a section of their friends or family to come to their aid and paint the other person as the source of the problem. Now, there are a few ways this couple can break out of this pattern, but one of the best places to start is with their anger. And I know learning to cope with and heal our anger is a long and complicated journey. But in the short run, it'll really help if 8s can practice restraining their anger rather than peppering the 4 with constant aggression. And the 4 can then practice expressing their anger before it mutates into this self-loathing isolation that pulls them away from the 8. There's a lot more nuance that goes into these psychological patterns. So as I say in pretty much every relationship episode, find a good therapist to help you navigate and heal these often subconscious trauma-based reactions. All right, next tip for this couple is to establish a few mutually agreed upon rules for your arguments. Things get way too personal, way too fast in this relationship. So work on finding and respecting an off-limits area when it comes to name calling or bringing up your most sensitive wounds. Like, hey, no saying I'm just like my father, okay? Now, a lot of this has to do with impulse control. And again, that's something that both types are gonna struggle with. So just try to have some patience with each other as you learn to respect this new boundary. All right, last thing I'll say here is that there's a ton of potential for 8s and 4s to bond over their very different perspectives if they have a shared belief system or common sense of purpose that brings them together. 4s and 8s are just way too passionate to be with someone that doesn't care deeply about the things they find truly important. So if it feels like you as the 4 or the 8 is always trying to convince the other person to appreciate the things you love, then that's a big red flag when it comes to the long-term potential of your relationship. And I guarantee you that what starts off as a lack of shared values will ultimately become a lack of intimacy, if not a deep sense of resentment. So get invested in what your partner loves or get out. All right, I don't know if that helped, hurt, or a little of both, but either way, we're basically done. So just hold on for one last segment, which is actually vital for the success of your relationship, and that's the patented YGAT relationship rating system. First up on the YGAT relationship rating system is the spice meter. And I would say that the 4-8 pairing is the front runner for #1 most spicy Enneagram pairing out there. Honestly, aside from the counterphobic 6 with an 8, I don't even know who comes close to this couple as far as spiciness goes. So yeah, they're definitely redlining it 10 out of 10, way over at the muy picante side of things. Next up is the power meter. And while every type 8 relationship has plenty of power, the more slow and sensitive energy of the 4 definitely dials things back a bit. Although the 4's integration of the type 1 traits could make this a dynamite collaboration if they're healthy. So I'm gonna put them squarely in the middle at productive. That leaves us with the fun meter, and I would put this couple anywhere at or beyond international escapades depending on their level of health, because let's say a young, uninhibited 4 hooked up with a wild child 8, then that would be like the epitome of 90s spring break. But for the sake of this couple's well-being, I'm gonna hope that they rein it in a bit and use those passports to go anywhere other than Cancun. So let's say a 7 out of 10, but I don't know, hard to say. All right, there you have it, folks. The Enneagram 4-8 relationship. Super spicy, semi-productive, potentially rock star levels of illegal fun-loving couple. Sounds like a documentary waiting to happen. That's a wrap on this Enneagram relationship episode for the Type 4 Individualist with a Type 8 Challenger. If you're shutting it down here, then I will say thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed it, and please hit those like and subscribe buttons for me on your way out if you haven't already. But hey, if you're sticking around for more Enneagram goodness, then I have got plenty of relationship-themed content for you to choose from right here on the screen, as well as some more lighthearted content if you need a break. Take your pick.